Time now 10 to 7, and Dr. Craig Gallagher moved to the US from Greenock in 2011 and qualified to vote in the elections just last year. He's a lecturer in history at a couple of small universities in New Hampshire. Good morning to you, Dr. Gallagher. Voting for the first time in a presidential election, what was that like?
Good morning. It was wonderful, actually. It was the first in-person ballot I have cast in a general election since 2011, when I voted in the Scottish Parliament elections while I still lived in Glasgow. So it brought back some nice memories. It's been too long since I stood in a polling place.
So what are the key differences then? What's it like voting in a presidential election in comparison to a Scottish parliamentary election?
I think the biggest difference is the ballot. I heard Frank Cogliano talking about this a little bit earlier on your program, but there are so many options listed on the ballot that it's almost head-spinning. You know, there are all these small ballot positions for things like register or probate that are a local city position. And at the top of the ballot, you have not only the traditional presidential candidates, but you also have third-party candidates. And perhaps one of my favorite innovations in America, you can write your own candidate in if you don't particularly like any of the candidates listed, which sometimes when you see some of the smaller ballots, you're tempted to write in, you know, Wile E. Coyote or Nicola Sturgeon. But none of that option really has any much hope of getting you anywhere, I don't think.
And were you tempted from the presidential ballot to pencil anybody else in?
There definitely have been a few moments during this campaign where I've definitely felt about writing in one of my personal political heroes over here, Senator Bernie Sanders. I was a big supporter of his during the primary campaign for his views on things like healthcare and bringing what I think is the United States up to date with the rest of the world on things like socialized universal healthcare. But in the end, I was happy to make my peace with voting for Joe Biden. I just think the alternative of another 4 years of Donald Trump was a little bit too much to stomach when it came down to it.
New Hampshire is generally a Democrat party state, isn't it?
Yes and no. Currently, they have Democrats at every level of federal representation, 2 Democratic congressmen and a congresswoman, and 2 senators. But our governor is a Republican, and until 2 years ago, the state level House and Senate were controlled by Republicans. There's been a little bit of a Democratic uptick at the state level, but Governor Sununu just won re-election. I'd say fairly surprisingly. A lot of people here think he handled COVID-19 really well. I think New Hampshire is more accurately described as a state that likes to go against the flow. Just when you think they're going to zig one way, sometimes they zag. And it's worth remembering that it was New Hampshire that first gave Donald Trump a national victory. He won the New Hampshire primary here in 2016, and it was the state that made him a national candidate for the first time.
Well, given what you've said about you've managed to make your peace with voting for Joe Biden, do you think that the Democrat campaign was inspiring enough for the usual voters, never mind trying to persuade Republicans to come on board?
Personally, I do not. I thought that the Democratic candidate, Joe Biden, and most of the people involved in the high levels of the Democratic campaign have embraced the strategy of letting Donald Trump beat himself. I think their attitude here was to sort of stay out of the way and allow Trump to sort of screw things up. Which, you could argue that he did. And this has been a pretty disastrous year by any standards economically, in terms of public health for the United States. Certainly, I'm a professor of American history, one of the more dramatic years in the country's history by far. But at the same time, I think, there was not a lot of attempts, I would say, to reach out to those voters to his left who maybe were looking for some of that energy, some of that vision that we saw early in the Democratic primary from candidates like Bernie Sanders, but also Elizabeth Warren. I would say, for the most part, no, not a particularly inspiring approach to this election.
And I know that this is the first election that you've been allowed to vote in, but you've lived there through a couple of the campaigns now. How has this one compared? This is my third presidential election since I moved to the United States. I think this one, obviously not COVID withstanding, which made it almost impossible to participate in person in many elections. Many electoral events that people in New Hampshire in particular love. I would say the biggest difference has been the extent to which Donald Trump and the rhetoric around getting Donald Trump out at whatever cost has really shaped the entire campaign, almost to the point of starving oxygen of any kind of policy discussion. I ask my students all the time, they're 18-year-old, 19-year-old first-time voters. What do you think that Joe Biden and Donald Trump will do if they become president? And the answer is gloat over victory for the other. There's not been a lot of policy discussion. That's where we're going to have to leave it, Craig. I'm sorry. Dr. Craig Gallagher there, who has from Greenock but moved to the US in 2011 and voted for the first time yesterday.
And of course, you know who else was from New Hampshire?